Hi there, and welcome to our kick drum synthesis course. In this course, I'm going to take you through every module you'd find in a kick drum synth, how it works, and how to correctly apply them to get any style of kick drum you desire. If you think about it, this is going to save you so much time as you won't have to sample surf for hours anymore just to find a kick drum that kind of fits the bill. And it's also going to allow you to make the exact kick drum you want without any compromises whatsoever. Towards the end of the course, I'm going to show you how I made each of these different styles of kick drums using Kick2 and various types of audio processing. I'm going to quickly play them back just so you can hear what they sound like yourself. So we've got various types of kicks here. We've got a big room, a deep house kick, a house kick, R&B, another house kick, and finally a heavy hitting techno kick. And with each and every single one of these, I am indeed using Kick2, and with most of these, I'm using some form or loads of processing. And I'm going to go through each and every one towards the end of the course. So without further ado, let's get right into it. I'm going to start by taking you through Kick2's UI. Now, Kick2 is one of the most powerful synthesizers for kick drum creation out there. I've used quite a few kick synthesizers before, including the Ultrabeat by Logic Pro. Now, I'm going to begin by just giving you a quick overview of Kick2's UI and explanation as to why we're using Kick2. Now, in my opinion, I've used quite a few kick drum synthesizers before, and Kick2 is by far the easiest to work with. And because of that, it allows for complete flexibility when it comes to kick creation. Let me go over the UI and you'll understand what I mean as well. So we'll begin by looking at the browser. Quite simple here. You can load presets by clicking where it says default and going through all of the presets. You've got the user presets as well, which would mean that if you saved your own presets, you'll find them here. And you've got DLC, which is extra downloadable content. So if you go on Sonic Academy's website, they sell loads of different additional preset packs that you can download for Kick2. Next, I want to look at this section here because this is the most important section of the whole synthesizer. This is a completely customizable envelope. So I can create points or nodes wherever I want, move them by holding Option on the keyboard, click and curve them, and also change their length, change their pitch. So just so you're fully aware, the y-axis is pitch, the x-axis is time. And you could also increase the envelope's length overall by clicking and dragging this over here. Now, just so you understand, I won't go through it in detail yet, I will in a few minutes, but the way a kick drum is made is simply by taking a sine wave and very quickly modulating the pitch to go down from a really high frequency to a really low frequency. So I've quickly gone ahead and created a MIDI clip, and I've set a loop around the MIDI clip so that I can press play. You can hear the kick and hear how the kick sound changes as I move around these nodes and change the way the pitch curves from a high frequency to a low frequency. So I'll begin by pressing play. It's the kick we have right now. I can make it a much thicker sound by getting it to pitch down over a longer period of time. I can make it more like an R&B kick if I let it pitch quite low. And then if I curve it and I get it to go down to roughly 80, 100 hertz very quickly, we lose a lot of that punch that you get around here. If I increase the length of time the pitch remains between 1 to 200 hertz, We get more of that mid-range punch. I can get rid of the clickiness by starting it at a lower frequency. I'm also going to mute this click because this is an additional sample that's playing over our synth. And I can make it very thin, like so. A couple of extra nodes were created here. I'm just going to delete them. There you go. See, you can change the sound of the kick substantially just by changing this line a little bit. So let me elaborate on this a bit more. Now, this here, this whole envelope controls just the pitch. You can see pitch is sort of pressed here like a button. And if I press amp, we've got a new line, and this would control the volume curve of the synthesizer. We're going to stick to pitch for now. So this controls the pitch of whatever oscillator waveform we have in the sub-control section. Now you see it says right now we have a sine wave, but there is a choice of a few different waves, sine, saw, square, triangle, as well as some other sampled waveforms. So kick live is an actual live kick drum that's been sampled, placed into kick 2, and we can adjust the pitch of that. Now, before I press play, I just want to warn you that for almost every kick, a sine wave is what you should be using. Anything other than a sine wave can add a lot of distortion when you modulate it via pitch. I'm still going to show you what it sounds like, but you'll hear that a sine wave is by far the cleanest form of sound. Now, in order for this to be active, we can't just select kick live. You'll see here it's still showing us a sine wave. We have to actually add or turn up this harmonics control. So without this, no matter what we select from the drop-down menu, it's still going to be producing a sine wave. If we turn this up, the waveform will be morphed to whatever we have selected from this drop-down menu. Do you hear all of that distortion that's been added? What if we select something else? What about a square wave? You see what I mean? It's not as clean. You can still get some sort of sounds, but not quite the same. Now, these could be really useful for creative style sounds, not necessarily kick drums. So using one of the tom presets, you could modulate the pitch and get some sort of tom drum sound. Like this. That'd be really, really useful. But it doesn't quite have the low end thickness of a kick drum. For that, you would indeed use a sine wave. Straight away, we have that thick low end. Now, I'm going to put the harmonics back. Of course, you can change the pitch, but there isn't really much point doing that from here because you can manually change the pitch of each node up or down. But if you want to change the pitch of all of the notes, then you can just move this up by 1. It will change them all by 1, but keep the same relative difference between them. That can be quite a useful feature. Now, there's 3 sections to a kick drum. The first is the transient. The transient is generally produced by the higher frequencies of the kick and tends to last a very short period of time. So just a quick tip before I explain where each section occurs. If you look over here where the mouse is hovering over, you see depending on where I've got the mouse placed, it tells us how long it's been from the beginning of the kick, as well as what frequency it's currently at. The transient would normally occur from the highest frequency of the kick to the mid-range frequency of the kick, and it usually lasts anything from 1 to maybe 5 milliseconds. It doesn't tend to last any longer. Sometimes you can layer another sample over your main kick which may produce a thicker and longer transient, such as a hi-hat sample. A lot of producers layer hi-hat samples over kicks, but in the main core kick drum, the transient doesn't tend to last any longer than 5 milliseconds. So it's very, very short. I want you to hear the difference it makes when I extend the length of the transient to 5 milliseconds by moving this to the right until I see the number 5 here, 0.005 rather. And when I remove the transient completely. So here it is with a long transient. Here it is with no transient. Now, if I increase where the pitch begins and increase the mid-range point, see any longer, and it starts to almost sound like a pitch sweep, which is something you don't want. You don't want the pitch sweep of the sine wave to be obvious in any way. So one more time. So we lose that high click. Just double check. Yeah, you can see on the amp envelope, we haven't got a fade in any way. It just begins immediately. So once you've set your transient to where you want it to be, now also normally pitch matters, because the higher you get the transient to begin, the clickier it's going to seem. Personally, I like to have it around the 3 to 5K range. It's not too clicky, but it's also not too dark that you're not really going to hear it. Then the rest of the kick is two more sections. One is the low mid punch. Now, the bit that you feel, if you've been to a club and you felt the kick kind of punching you in the chest before, in a good way, that would be down to the 300 to around 100 hertz. So depending on how long you get the pitch sweep to last in that frequency range, you're going to get either a weaker, less punchy kick or a thicker, more punchy kick. So if I extend this to the right, what it's doing is it's making the pitch sweep from 294 hertz down to 41 hertz take a longer amount of time. So because the frequencies stay there longer, you're going to get more punch. Hear how punchy that suddenly became compared to just by moving this node here, we can get so many different styles of kicks. This could be absolutely fine for a normal house track. Maybe the kick length is a bit too long, but that we wouldn't change with the kick, we would change with the amp envelope, like so. But when I drag it further to the left to about 160 or so milliseconds, we get so much more punch. I extend the length here. That's a really heavy, big room kick just by moving this. Of course, you can get a lot more detailed with them as well. Not that you have to, but I could say, well, I want the frequency from around 294 to 110 to last quite a long time. So you see now the pitch sweep from here to here is going to take about 90 milliseconds, which is quite a long time when it comes to kick length. And then I want it to go down to the sub very quickly. So bypass those lower 100 hertz. Maybe I want to do the opposite. I want to get down to those 100 hertz or to around 100 hertz very quickly. And then from 100 to the sub fundamental, it pitches down quite slowly instead. So we don't have as much energy between 3 to 100, but we've got more energy between 110 to 44 hertz. So far I've gone through the transient. Transient is the first short section of the kick. It's what allows the kick to come through in smaller sound systems as well, which wouldn't produce as much bass. And it starts at the highest frequency the kick will generate. So usually for me, around 5 kilohertz. Then we've got the mid-range punch. This is between 3 to 100 hertz. This lasts generally a fairly long time. No matter the curve, it's still going to last a fairly long time. And then the final part is the sub-fundamental frequency. The sub-fundamental frequency is what determines the tuning of the kick. What I mean by that is, once the pitch curve has finished, the kick has to land at a specific pitch. And then it has to stay at that pitch for a certain period of time. This is determined by the amp envelope and the length that you choose. That pitch is the sub rumble, the deep kind of rumble you hear in the kick towards the end of its duration. So first you're going to get the transient and the punch, and then you're going to get that boom, that low end sub frequency. Now, if I extend the amp length, you'll hear it get to this point towards the end, and then you'll hear that it will sustain there for about half the duration of the kick. So the amp envelope is giving us, 600 milliseconds right now. That's its duration. We're getting to the sub frequency after 162 milliseconds. So for the rest, 450 milliseconds, we're staying at this sub frequency. Without that, we don't get that deep rumble that you hear. Now, there's a great way for me to demonstrate this. If I add an EQ to the track, I open up the frequency analyzer. I've just moved kick 2 out of the way quickly. You'll see that the sub frequency is this one right here. We've got the transient around here, the high frequencies, the mid-range around here, and the sub around here. Now I can kind of change the way that curve looks by, first of all, reducing the length of the kick. Now, you see how the sub frequency isn't as defined, and it's also not sustaining as long. I could also extend the mid-range, the 3 to 100 hertz. And now we've got a lot more energy here, even more so than the sub. You can find a nice medium point where you get an even amount of energy from around 300 hertz down to the sub. I could also make some parts weaker, not only using the pitch, but using the amp envelope. So if I lower the volume around the mid-range part and perhaps increase it for the sub, you see now we have a bit of a dip around here and a much more powerful sub again. So you really want to experiment with these envelopes because they can give you such drastically different results when it comes to kick drum creation. And you don't have, like I said, to sample surf for hours on end just to find a kick that's kind of right for you. You can instantly, as long as you know what you're doing, get the result you want. Now that I've explained the envelopes, I'm going to go through a few other features, and then we'll start looking at how to make specific styles of kicks. Finally, at the end, we're going to look at audio processing. Now let's have a look at all of the other settings within the pitch and the amp envelope. So first of all, let's look at these three here. Snap. Simply all it does is allow you to snap the changes of the nodes to a pitch. So for example, if I move this node up, it's going to go from A2 to the next note, which would be A sharp 2. Whereas if I've got snap off, it will go 1 hertz at a time or 2, depending on how slowly you move it. Okay, so ideally leave snap on because then you can select a specific pitch each time. See, when I go up even just a little bit, it moves it up by a few hertz to the next note. Tags just toggles on and off the actual display that shows you which note and frequency the nodes are currently on. Gate is where it gets a little bit interesting, because with gate off, the length that you've chosen your kick to be is how long the kick will be played for. However, when you turn gate on, if the MIDI notes which are triggering the kick are shorter than the length of the kick will abruptly cut off from wherever that point is. So if these MIDI notes have a duration that would allow the kick to play up to here, this part of the kick would not be played, it would be muted. Have a listen. Since I'm shortening the MIDI notes, the kick is also decreasing its length. Usually, turning gate off is the best way to go, and then adjusting the length of the kick by using the amp envelope. So if you want it to be shorter, you can bring back the end of the amp envelope, making it end quicker. Just like that. Now, you've got a couple of other things. You've got curve, save, and reset. So personally, I don't think you have to use this because you can save from here the entire preset. So if I save this, now whatever preset I had loaded will be overwritten. Or if I select save as preset, I can save it as a new preset under the user presets folder. So I can call this kick tutorial 1, press save, and then load it up from here. And the difference is that this curve preset will only save the curve that you've created. So if I click save on this and I go house kick curve, pitch, then over here I can select this house kick curve pitch. But over here, when I load this preset, any other module of the synth that you've done something to, those settings will also load onto it. Okay, let's move on to these clicks, as they're quite an important part of the kick. Now, these clicks are just samplers that allow you to load an audio sample and then combine it with the original kick in whatever way you choose. So if I'm looking at click 1, this would be the volume envelope for the first sample. Click 2, volume envelope for the second sample. Right now, there isn't one loaded there. Click 3, volume envelope for the third sample. Now, if I select load, it will open up a browser and I could go and load in any audio sample that I want from my own personal libraries. So I could go to Kalani sample library. Just as an example, I'll go to my minimal techno, WAVs, drum hits, and I'll load in a hat. And then this hat will be played alongside the kick if I choose to. Now, right now I've muted it. If I unmute it and I press play, you'll hear the original kick and the click, and I'll solo both of them just so you can hear how they're combining and then how they're played separately. Now I've got some really cool features that allow me to morph whatever sample I've loaded into the sampler. So I can change the pitch of it. I'll solo it so you can have a listen to that. And I can change it in small increments if I hold Option or Alt on my keyboard. I can double click to put it back to its center position. I can change the length, but personally, I prefer going into the sampler, zooming in from here. So I'm clicking here and zooming in, and then you can drag right and left to go wherever you want on the view. Now, if I change the length from here, it just cuts it out abruptly. But if I create another node, I can get it to have a little bit of a fade out, which to me would sound a lot better. Because when you have a sharp transient sound cutting off abruptly, it can create some unwanted clicks in the actual audio file. Because what's happening is the speaker that's generating the sound is stopping its movement and potentially jumping back to its center position immediately, rather than in a smooth motion. Therefore, when you do want to make something shorter, it's best to have a little bit of a fade out using the envelope. Now you can also change its start time. So if I zoom in again, you see how there's a little bit of a gap in the beginning. Let's say I wanted to start immediately. I can increase the start time. Again, hold Option to increase it in small increments. Take it to about there, and then it will begin straight away. One more thing I can do is get this in phase with our main kick. Now, because this is a hi-hat, it doesn't have many frequencies that correlate with our main kick drum. I've gone ahead and I've dragged in two other samples that closely resemble a kick drum or even are a kick drum, so that I can show you what phase cancellation is and what you should do to avoid it. So we're going to go into Click 2's view, and we're going to click here where it says Sub View, and there's a little blue box next to it. And what this will allow us to do is view the waveform of our main kick, as well as the waveform of our sample right beside each other. Now you'll notice that at certain parts of the waves, they're completely out of phase. So what that means is the blue line here represents our main kick. And you'll see that where the mouse is here, follow it, the blue line, our main kick, has negative polarity, and the green line, which is our sample, has positive polarity. Now let me explain the problem that this can cause. Imagine this for a moment. Let's take just one of the waves, so just the blue waveform. What this is the signal that's being fed to the speakers. Then the speaker cone is moving in this exact motion in order to generate this kick drum sound. Now imagine we're sending the speaker another wave, but that wave has completely opposite information, which means when one of the waves is telling the speaker to pull back, the other sound is telling the speaker to push forward. And what's happening is the speaker stays right in the center. Kind of like tug of war. It's like two different sounds playing tug of war with the speaker. The speaker stays in the center and generates no sound whatsoever. Now, as you can see, these are not completely opposites. What that means is at certain times they do combine together, or they're not 180 degrees out of phase. So here they are completely out of phase. Blue line and the green line are polar opposites. However, let's say over here, they start to come in phase a little bit. Over here, they are in phase. Over here, again, they're slightly out of phase, and so on. Now, sometimes you cannot put two waves perfectly in phase. If you did, it would completely change the sound that you're going to be getting from one of the samples. For example, by changing the pitch, I can compress or expand the waveform. So I could try and up the pitch of this sample to try and get the two sounds as much in phase as possible. So you'll see now that most of the beginning phase is in sync, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to sound better, because I've taken this sample and I've pitched it up by 8 semitones. When you pitch something up that high, it totally changes its sound. So the original sound was like this, 8 semitones up, like this. Completely different. You may not want to go that far. So the first thing that I would advise you do is play both the sample and the original kick together, and then simply polarity invert. What this button does is it flips the phase. So when you invert the polarity, all I mean is the phase response of the sample is being flipped 180 degrees. So whenever the phase was going down, negative polarity, that will be flipped so that it's going up, positive polarity, and vice versa. And 90% of the time, all you're going to need to do is flip the polarity, compare the two versions, and pick the one that sounds best. Is it the one with the polarity flipped, or is it the one with normal polarity? If that doesn't work, then we move on to the next step, which would be adjusting the pitch. Now, after testing the sample and the kick played together, I feel as though it sounds a lot better with the polarity inverted. There's a much more punchy mid-range than with the polarity as normal. However, if you pay close attention, the low frequencies of the overall resulting sound are slightly reduced with the polarity inverted than with the polarity as normal. So, what does this mean? Well, if we open up both views, you'll see that with the phase inverted, during the beginning of the kick, which is where the transient and the punchy part of the kick occur, they're mostly in phase. But during the end of the kick, they go quite significantly out of phase. See, here they're completely out of phase. Here they're completely out of phase. Here they're almost completely out of phase. And that carries on for a while. Out of phase, out of phase, out of phase, out of phase. Which is why we're probably losing a lot of the low frequency response when the phase is inverted. When the phase is normal, there's quite a bit of phase cancellation going on at the beginning of the kick, but towards the end, they're perfectly in phase. Therefore, we're not losing that low end rumble. So here would be a case of which sounds better. But it might also be that you can change the pitch of one of them in order to try and compress them to be in phase. So what we could do is phase invert, but then, I'll zoom out a bit, either lower or get the pitch to be a bit higher until we try to get them to be more in phase. Do you see? They're not perfect, but they're better than before. Let's have a listen to this. Sounds much better to my ears. And this all has to do with the phase response of the original kick combined with the sample. You have to try and get the phases to be as inline as possible, because if you don't, you may be layering more and more samples, but actually weakening the sound rather than making the sound thicker and fuller overall. So make sure you check the phase. Step one, you invert the phase, check which one sounds better. If it's still not good enough, you can change the pitch. You could also change the start position. See, this allows you to start the sample later on in its cycle, but you would be losing the first part of the sample. So if you want to retain the transient of the sample, if you increase this, you lose that part. So that's why I tend to go for the phase inversion button first and then for the pitch. And if that's still not good enough, I can move the start position and get the sample to start a bit later on. Alternatively, you could replace the sample with another sample that might work a little better. Now, there's one more parameter I want to talk about, and that is the filter. Super, super useful, because if we go back to our view over here and we go back to the original phase inversion where the beginning of the sample is in phase with our original kick, but the end of the sample is out of phase, well, the end of the sample is only producing low frequencies. You can tell by the distance from one peak to another. The longer the distance, the lower the frequency that it's generating. So we could get away from that problem by increasing the high pass filter. See, what that's doing is adding a high pass filter like this, cutting off all the low frequencies. So the beginning of the sample is in phase, and because the end of the sample is out of phase, we're simply turning on a high pass filter and getting rid of those low frequencies that would conflict and phase cancel with our original kick. So that can be another method you can use. And then the resulting sound would be this. So we're getting rid of all those really low frequencies. There you go. And we retain those high frequencies as well. So to summarize, phase invert to check which sounds better. If it's still not being fixed, you can change the pitch, or you can high pass filter, or you could do both. In this case, for me, I'm going to go for both options, change the pitch to get them to be as perfectly in phase as possible, and high pass filter a little bit as well. That combination to me sounds the best. Now, I'm also not going to let the sample play for its entire duration. So I'm going to fade it out around here like this. And then I'll adjust its volume. Fantastic. Now, I want to quickly talk about this keyboard icon that you find on all of the clicks as well as the sub-control oscillator. This allows you to key track your MIDI notes. So by default, the pitch that the kick is generating is determined completely by the pitch envelope. And the pitch of the actual samples is just the original pitch of the sample, unless you've changed the pitch by a few semitones using the pitch control. If you turn on key tracking, however, the pitch that's going to be generated depends on the pitch of your MIDI notes. So if we've got our key being triggered at C1, then it's going to play the original pitch that you've selected on your envelope. However, if you move it up by one, the pitch moves up by one semitone. Up by another, it moves up by another semitone. It's not represented on the screen, but that's what happens audibly. Let me move it up by a few pitches and I'll activate the key tracking on click 2 as well. You can hear that the pitch is changing. Now, the easiest way to keep track of what pitch you're playing is by putting the pitch envelope down to C1. And then whichever MIDI note you choose to play, that's the fundamental pitch that's going to be generated by kick 2. The reason for this is because when you send the MIDI note C1 to kick 2, it's going to generate whatever pitches you've selected on the pitch envelope. So if the fundamental frequency of the pitch envelope matches the MIDI note C1, then if we move it up to D1, this fundamental frequency will also be generating a D1 rather than something different. However, if this was a D1 originally, D1 would be produced when you're sending the kick to a C1. Therefore, when you'd be moving the MIDI note up to a D1, what you would then get is actually an E1, and it would be difficult to keep track of. So just as a rule of thumb, if you're going to key track kick 2, you want to have the pitch of your pitch envelope, the fundamental frequency of it, on C1, and then use the MIDI notes to determine the actual fundamental pitch of the kick. We're now going to look at the compressor of kick 2. However, before I show you how to use the compressor within the plugin, I'm actually going to load a third-party compressor called Neutron. Neutron is actually multiple different plugins, but we're going to use the compressor of Neutron. And it's made by a company called Isotope. They make amazing plugins. Now, the reason why I've loaded this is because it has a really incredible visual display showing you exactly what the compressor is doing to the sound. So in case you don't know what a compressor does, this is going to help you understand exactly what the compressor is doing to the sound. Now, a compressor has a threshold. And when the signal of a sound goes beyond that threshold, the compressor will attenuate the signal of that sound. In other words, it will reduce the volume of that sound once it goes beyond a set threshold. So with this threshold here, I can determine at which point compression will begin, meaning how loud does the signal have to be in order for the compression to start attenuating the sound. So if the threshold is at maximum level, at 0 decibels, it's unlikely we're going to get any compression occurring because the signal of our kick drum won't be reaching beyond 0 decibels. I'm going to press play. You'll see the signal and you'll see that it's going to be just below the threshold line. See, so it's actually reaching just about where the threshold line is. That's because we've set the output of kick 2 to be 0. If I lower the output of the kick synthesizer by a bit, now you'll see that the kick is reaching a few decibels below the threshold line. Therefore, the compressor isn't doing anything at all. If I lower the threshold to below the highest point of the kick, you're going to start seeing a line that's dipping the volume of the kick drum whenever the kick goes above the threshold. So you see this orange line? That's representing the dip in volume. See, normally it's a straight line. Whenever the kick passes the threshold, the signal is reduced. Now, how much it's reduced above the threshold depends on the ratio. So a 2-to-1 ratio means for every 2 decibels above the threshold, 1 decibel is attenuated. So if our kick signal was reaching -10 and our threshold was -20, with a ratio of 2-to-1, for every 2 decibels, 1 is attenuated. So it's going 10 decibels above the threshold, therefore 5 will be attenuated. Essentially, the signal will be attenuated by half of the decibel amount above the threshold. I hope this makes sense. If it doesn't, all you really need to know is that the higher the ratio, the more compression or attenuation you're going to get to the signal above the threshold. However, the lower the ratio, the less compression or attenuation you're going to get. So as I move the ratio control, you're going to see the amount of attenuation change. See, at a 1.2-to-1 ratio, the amount of attenuation is very small. With a really high ratio, the amount of attenuation we're getting is much more drastic. Now, as a rule of thumb, anything above 4-to-1 ratio is quite heavy compression. Anything below 4-to-1 is fairly mild compression. And something like a 2-to-1 ratio would be relatively soft compression, something that would be used if you don't want the compressor's action to be too noticeable. So I don't want to do a whole course on compression right now because that's covered in our music production course, but it's good for you to understand roughly how a compressor works. So just to summarize, if the signal is below the threshold, the compressor will kick in. How much the compressor attenuates the signal depends on the ratio. You also have an attack and release controls. Hopefully, these are fairly self-explanatory to you, but if not, attack determines how long it takes for the compressor to kick in. So if attack is at 100 milliseconds, it will take 100 milliseconds from the point at which the signal exceeds the threshold for the compressor to reach its full compression ratio. So you'll see that the compression kind of comes in gradually. with a quick attack comes in immediately, straight line. You see the difference from here compared to with a slightly longer attack. It's a more gradual reduction in volume. And the release is the opposite. Once the signal has gone back below the threshold, so in this case, once the kick has finished, how long does it take for the compressor to reset to no attenuation whatsoever? So with a long release, you see that we're not giving the compressor enough time to reset its compression amount before the next kick. With a short release, it's compressing immediately. So you want to find that kind of medium point. You want a release that is long enough so that it doesn't sound as though the compression is resetting immediately. So you want a release that is quick enough that it releases before the next kick drum sound, but you also don't want the release to be so quick that it sounds as though it's jumping up to max volume immediately. So roughly 80 to 100 milliseconds should be fine. That works for us. If you want to know even more about compressors, then please watch our compression video in our Ableton music production course, and we cover compressors in extreme detail. But hopefully this has given you a good overview as to how a compressor works. Now, going back to the compressor in kick 2, we have a threshold, we have a ratio, we have attack, and we have release. And we also have a makeup gain. Now, as I mentioned, compression attenuates the volume of a sound. So the makeup gain is to boost that signal again to make up for the loss of volume due to the compressor's attenuation. That's all it's there for. So if you're compressing with a high ratio quite heavily, you can see the middle decibel meter shows you the amount of reduction occurring. You can hear the volume got significantly lower. So we can make up that loss of volume using the makeup gain. Now, I'm compressing an extreme amount here. So normally you wouldn't compress this much. You wouldn't potentially have this higher ratio and or this lower threshold, but I just wanted to explain what the makeup gain does. Now, conventionally, a compressor is used to even out the volume of a long recorded audio file. So if you were recording a singer, they might not sing every word with the same volume. So you might want to use a compressor to even out the different words. So some of the words they would sing more loud than others, you would attenuate those with a compressor so that they're more equal in volume to the quiet words. In this case, because we're working with MIDI, every single kick drum hit is equal in volume to the last. So you might ask, why do we need a compressor here? Well, you don't have to compress an entire hit from beginning to end. You could compress individual parts of the kick drum. So if you want to soften the transient of the kick a bit, which is the beginning of the kick, you can see in the waveform right here, then we could lower the threshold a little bit so that it's compressing just a tiny bit. Increase the ratio so that it's quite a high ratio, have instant attack, and as quick as possible release. And what that's going to do is compress the beginning of the kick, but leave the end of the kick uncompressed. Therefore, changing the overall wave to something more similar to this. Again, you might ask, well, why don't we do this with the volume envelope? The reason for this is because if we did it with a volume envelope, we could only achieve the result of this to either the click or the sub separately. So we would have to mimic the volume curves on the envelopes for both our sub oscillator and our clicks. And whilst that sounds okay in practice, in reality, compression helps gel and glue multiple samples together because they're all feeding the compressor. And when the compressor decides to attenuate, it attenuates all of them at the same time. And when the compressor resets, it resets all of them again at the same time. So compressors can help glue and gel multiple samples and our kick synth together to sound more like one unified kick drum. So ideally, you would use a compressor for these purposes. Now, by the same token, compressors can also be used as saturation units. So here I could add a compressor known as the CLA76. Now this compressor is a compression emulation of an analog compressor that has been around for decades in the world's best studios. And whenever you would put a sound through this compressor with certain settings, it wouldn't only attenuate the sound, but it would also saturate and distort the sound, similar to our distortion module over here, but in its own unique way. And the amazing thing would be that it would give you a combination of compression and saturation and really glue everything together. So I can apply the correct settings to get this kind of saturation. I'll turn off the compressor module in Kick 2. I'll turn down the output in case it's a bit loud, and I'll increase the amount of compression by boosting the input. And I want you to hear the result that this compressor gives you compared to the clean compressor we had earlier on. Do you hear that roughness, that distortion that it's generating? Without, with. It's a bit extreme. Super nice. So if you want that kind of thick, deep rumble, using something like this analog emulation of the 1176 compressor would help you achieve that. So compression is used to control the envelope of a sound, but it can also be used to saturate and gel and glue together multiple samples which are supposed to combine to make one sound. Now, finally, we have the limiter. The limiter is actually just a compressor, but the limiter has a ratio that is infinite, which means it doesn't let the sound go beyond the level of the threshold. So, whereas with a compressor, we could have the threshold set to here, and depending on the ratio, it may attenuate the volume a lot or just a little. A limiter is kind of like having a compressor with the maximum possible ratio, and therefore it wouldn't let the sound go anywhere beyond the actual threshold point. Now, even within this compressor, we can't set an infinite ratio. It's still 30:1. It's still not absolute 100% compression. However, with the limiter, it is. So watch this peak in the decibel meter here. As I lower the limiter, we get compression equal to where the threshold of the limiter is. By lowering this line, we are lowering the threshold point. Now, you may have noticed the volume stayed the same even though we're getting a lot of attenuation. That's because this limiter has an automatic makeup gain feature. So whereas with this compressor, we have to manually make up the loss of volume using the makeup gain control, with the limiter, it does it automatically for us, so we don't have to worry about increasing the volume to make up for the loss. When we open up the settings, we have a few extra controls for the limiter. We have a look ahead and a release time. Now, the look ahead is quite similar, sort of, to the attack parameter of a compressor. See, with none, as soon as the limiter senses the signal of the kick cross the threshold, the limiter will kick in and it will start compressing. But that can still take a few milliseconds for the limiter to actually react. So let's say with this waveform, the limiter sees the kick begin around here. It might only start compressing a couple of milliseconds later from around here. So we're going to get the beginning of the kick come through uncompressed, and therefore it's going to produce a very sharp and short clicky transient, like it is right now. If we set the look ahead to high, we're telling the limiter to look ahead by a few milliseconds, so that as soon as it sees a sound not begin, but about to begin in a few milliseconds, the limiter has already begun attenuating the signal. So as soon as the kick drum begins, the signal begins attenuated. And listen to how the clickiness will have disappeared completely with the look ahead set to high. Way less clicky with the look ahead set to high than none. Medium is kind of a middle point between the two. Now, release time, again, very similar to the release of a compressor. What this will allow you to do is change whether the limiter stops the attenuation the instant it goes below the threshold or a few milliseconds later. And again, the result is we can have, with a slow release time, the sub of the kick be less prominent because the sub usually occurs towards the end of the kick. So if we're not releasing the limiter immediately, it's not going to be as loud. But if you wanted a big room style kick, you'd have the release fast so that you get that boost in volume in the sub fundamental of the kick. If you can't hear a difference, make sure you're wearing good headphones or listening on good monitors. I can hear a clear difference, and hopefully you can as well. So the way you would use a limiter is if you want, again, to gel everything together a bit more, but potentially reduce the transient and increase the intensity of that sub fundamental. So no limiter, a bit of limiter. If I add a slow release time, we're not getting as much of a low boost. And a quick look ahead, none look ahead, we're going to get a bit more of a transient. You see how much it can thicken up a sound again, even though technically all it's doing is attenuating the volume at certain parts of the kick, which go above the threshold. So now that I've gone through all of the modules, before we move on to the next part, which will be analyzing the different kicks that I've made here above, as well as the processing that I've applied to them, I want you to go to your kick drum synth and try creating a few different kick drums using only the internal modules. So regardless of the synth you're using, you'll definitely have an oscillator with a pitch envelope that you can assign to it to modulate the pitch. You'll also have an amp envelope, and you may also have some extra modules such as the clicks, which are samples that you can add, potentially equalizers and saturation effects and things like that. But at the very least, you should have an oscillator with a pitch envelope and a volume envelope that you can assign to that oscillator to create your kick pitch curve. And remember, you have to start at a high frequency and quickly go to a low frequency. And depending on how that pitch curve goes from the high to the low frequency, and also the duration at certain frequency regions, you'll get totally different results. So go ahead and experiment, make a few different kicks, and then come back to the course and we'll go through analyzing loads of different high quality kicks for different genres, as well as the audio processing that I've applied to get the final result. See you in a bit.